Hello, welcome to the Socialism in the 21st Century panels, part of the Historical Materialism online conference. My name is Michael Wayne. We've got three speakers here to address three aspects of this question of socialism in the 21st century. We have got Moran, who's going to be unpacking the principle of equality, which has always been central to socialism, and explore how it would need to be extended to underpin any future mode of socialist production. We have Oisín Gilmore, who's going to address the political route to socialism, to what extent that route lies through the legislative and executive organs of the capitalist state, a long-running debate, obviously. And we have Paula Rauhala, who's going to be looking at the accountancy principle of a future socialist mode of production. Presumably, principles like equality would be very substantially expanded in any such future society, but in order for that to not be castles in the air, sandcastles in the air, it'd have to be grounded in some sort of material measure of wealth in order to make allocation decisions, for example. So Paul is going to be exploring the labour theory of value in the context of a socialist planned economy, I think, by looking back at previous debates. So our first speaker, they'll be, as I said, they'll speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and there will be plenty of time for questions. So do put questions in the chat box. Our first speaker is Marie Moran. She's an assistant professor in equality studies at the University College Dublin, and she's also director of the University College Dublin Equality Studies Centre. So Marie, over to you.
I'm going to share my screen. So, I assume everybody can see that. So my paper today is based on a book I'm working on called Inequality in the 21st Century, and I'll begin by first briefly discussing the relationship between equality and socialism, and then I'm going to attempt to sketch out an equality framework that may be useful to the renewal of socialist politics. So there's a long-standing practical and theoretical association between the value of equality and socialism as a critique of capitalism and a proposal for its replacement. Historically and currently, some of the most powerful movements for equality have come from socialism. In addition, many people take the commitments and ambitions of equality and socialism to be aligned, if not equivalent. But actually, the relationship between the value of equality and socialism is much less straightforward, curious even. The most powerful theoretical formulation of socialism in Marxism has neglected to theorize equality at all. Although a commitment to equality is almost taken for granted within socialist discourse, socialism does not require and often rejects an explicit normative articulation of equality. The most prominent egalitarian thinkers of the 20th and 21st centuries and the most rigorous conceptualizations of equality, I'm talking about explicit conceptualizations, are not associated with the Marxist or socialist tradition at all, but often in opposition to it, within the liberal, or more specifically, liberal egalitarian tradition, which is often regarded as antithetical to the ambitions of socialism. Actually, existing socialism operationalized a relatively narrow conception of equality that undermined freedoms and often reduced the socialist project to a technocratic, rationalistic, authoritarian enterprise. Now, revitalized democratic socialism in the US and the recent leftward revival of Labour in the UK, both struggling to mobilize a conception of equality that can account for the full range of prominent equality issues. And meanwhile, while most of the contemporary struggles around race, gender, and sexuality are clearly deeply concerned with a range of inequalities, including material and economic inequalities, their relationship to socialist politics remains at best strained, with self-professed socialists and so-called, though I hate the term, social justice warriors, often opposing each other in contemporary political organizing. So I think we should be concerned with this dissociation of a politics of equality from a socialist politics. However, I believe that efforts to consolidate and strengthen the left should not involve any attempt to suppress those movements that pursue racial, gender, and sexual equality, but rather, as many others here argue, should seek to bring those politics into the heart of socialism. And I think one of the ways we can do this is by realigning equality with socialism. That is, by putting the value of equality right at the heart of socialism and bringing a socialist perspective and ambition to bear on the many and varied problems of equality that the left struggles with. So this aim can be informed, or it can be expressed in terms of two guiding ideas. The first is that substantive equality in the conditions of people's lives can only be realized as part of a wider material structural transformation. I believe this has been best represented historically and theoretically by socialism, broadly understood, though it may arise in other materialist structuralist forms. Efforts to theorize or achieve equality that, in contrast, abstract from actually existing social structures and material conditions as sources of inequality, tend either or both towards high levels of abstraction and rootlessness, or towards a liberal reformism that accepts the frame that is part of the generative problem of inequality. The second guiding idea concerns the particular conception of equality at stake. What is required is a robust pluralist conception of equality that is attentive to the complexity and multidimensionality of the sources and experiences of inequality, and that is rooted normatively and strategically in both everyday morality and a full range of social justice movements. Without this, a project for equality is necessarily exclusive, and socialism specifically will succumb to its routine distortions that arise from the suppression of human freedoms and the reduction of a plurality of struggles to economic ones. So this effort to restore a multidimensional conception of equality to the heart of socialism is offered as an exercise in critical theory that combines critique with explanations and visions for change. The framework itself is built around four key questions that continually arise in everyday as well as specialist discussions around equality. The first is, why does equality or inequality matter? Second is, what are the ways in which people can be unequal? Thirdly, how can equality be explained? And finally, how can equality be realized? And though it's not part of my presentation today, in the second part of the book, I tried to apply this framework that I developed to what I see as four key issues that the left are grappling with, which I refer to as the problem of elites, the problem of identity, the problem of borders, and the problem of climate. So, beginning with the first question, why does equality matter? I suggest we should begin from the critique of inequality rather than from an articulation of a positive vision of equality. Iris Marion Young argues that critical theory rejects as illusory the effort to construct a universal normative system insulated from a particular society, and insists that normative reflection must begin from historically specific circumstances because there is nothing but what is, the given, the situated interest in justice from which to start. This approach aligns well with everyday morality, with various social movements struggling against a range of inequalities, and with a Marxist approach that has been fiercest in its critique of inequality. These objections to equality focus on both personal and social harms. Inequality harms people's capacity to live a good life on a personal level, but it also harms societies, or what we think of as social goods that are collectively owned and benefited from. Recognition of the social and personal harms caused by inequality provides significant moral grounds for the case for greater equality. But what should this equality look like, and should we spell it out? For quite some time now, there has been resistance on the left to providing a blueprint for a new society. But this resistance is looking increasingly untenable in the face of the failure of left movements to gain political traction or achieve concrete social reform. So there are growing calls for a vision of a new society to be specified. In theoretical terms, we might say, as Andrew Sayre does, flourishing consists in more than the absence of suffering or need. It has positive content. At the same time, given some of the misgivings of those concerned with the construction of a supposedly universalist but often exclusionary set of ideals for a just world, it seems that we should not seek a strict blueprint for equality, but I suggest should rather seek the removal or serious reduction of those forms of inequality that impair flourishing. And I define flourishing in very broad terms as the capacity to live a good life without material deprivation or unmet needs, and with ample and real prospects for political, social, and cultural engagement. But rather than specify exactly what this looks like for each person or various groups of people, we should instead seek radical equality in the conditions of people's lives so that everybody can flourish. On to the second question, what are these inequalities that impair flourishing? Drawing on discussions of inequality that animate social movements, everyday morality, public and political discourse, as well as academic work across disciplines, I think we can identify 5 key ways in which inequality is typically conceptualized. And these are what I refer to in the framework as sectoral inequalities, referring to different spheres of society, typically economic, cultural, social, and political. Categorical inequalities, that is inequalities between groups defined by social categories, typically race, gender, social class, ability, sexuality, age, and others. Distributive inequalities, where one group or person has less of some valued resource than another, and where that resource may be very broadly defined in terms of assets, capital, or well-being, or more narrowly defined in terms of income, education, qualifications, and health. Relational inequalities, a relationship in which one group is subject to the power or disrespect of another. This includes exploitation, oppression, marginalization, powerlessness, imperialism, domination, humiliation, disrespect, and belittling. Finally, spatial inequalities, where inequality is identified between different regions, typically local, national, and global inequalities. Now, when people generally interested in equality, including socialists, discuss equality, they often muddle these distinct ways of conceptualizing inequality together. So it is useful to put some analytical shape on these different ways of viewing and conceptualizing inequality. Returning to the guiding question here, we see that of these 5 categories, only the relational and distributive perspectives properly describe the ways in which people can be unequal. That is, people can be unequal either where they have less of some valued resource than others, or where they are unequally positioned in a relationship with others and so subject to their power or disrespect. In contrast, social categorical and spatial perspectives on inequality do not so much describe the nature of the inequality as identify the groups that suffer from it. Therefore, what is in fact at stake in accounts of inequalities of gender, race, or class, categorical inequality, or local, national, or global inequalities, spatial inequality, is a description of relational or distributional inequalities as they exist between different social groups or different regions geographically. To illustrate very crudely, if we were to ask what is the nature of inequality between men and women, gender inequality, we might answer by saying that women have a lower income than men, an instance of distributive inequality, or that men oppress women, an instance of relational inequality. Omitting the sectoral approach for now for time reasons, we see that the categorical and spatial approaches cut across the distributive and relational, because in general, an inequality is always between at least 2 parties. And so categorical and spatial approaches are 2 ways of categorizing the parties that are either in an unequal relationship or distributively unequal. This can be schematically mapped as a straight matrix. The emphasis on people and places, that's the categorical and spatial, also serves to contextualize and materialize what might otherwise be abstract discussions of inequality that I'm trying to get away from. While the relational and distributive approaches are widely considered to be oppositional in the political theory literature, as well as more broadly in the so-called redistribution or class versus identity politics debates, I suggest it is possible and fruitful to pursue both approaches, as each generates different insights into the nature of inequality and how we might go about remedying it. Turning then to question 3, how can inequality be explained? I ask, what kinds of explanation for inequality should we favor in this project to restore a multidimensional conception of equality to the heart of socialism? And how should these explanations relate to the other components of the framework, that is to normative critique, conceptualization of inequalities, and remedies for inequality? First thing to say is that accounts from normative political theory, which are strong in terms of conceptualizing and evaluating different kinds of inequalities, are poor on explanation. Socialists and others complain of, for example, of a bourgeois morality of liberal equality, where the focus on the immorality of the inequality distracts attention from the structures which enable and encourage it. This suggests that the kind of robust explanation already associated with the socialist tradition that focuses on deep structures, systems, and causes is immediately preferable. But contrary to certain assumptions, this kind of explanation need not exclude a normative component. Rather, and from the focus of critical theory, critique must combine the explanatory and the normative. In terms of achieving this, I think it is possible to use the categories of my framework to tie deep structural explanation to normative analysis. In addition, these categories can be deployed as meso-level explanatory tools within bigger accounts of capitalism, patriarchy, and racism and their intersections. So, for example, in relation to categorical inequalities, we see that concepts such as gender and race do not just describe the nature of the social division that underpins or is made manifest in a distributive or relational inequality, but also offer avenues for critical, historical, explanatory inquiry. Thus, we can ask, how has it come to be that gender, race, sexuality, etc., structured social institutions, norms, and relations in a way that generates relational and distributive inequalities between the groups in question? And similarly, with spatial inequalities, we can ask, how has it come to be that the organization of geographical space, in terms of urban, rural, centre, periphery, metropole, colony, has structured social relations in a way that generates relational and distributive inequalities between different regions? Finally, in relation to the types of explanations we seek, we should ask where we stand on the idealist-materialist divide that underpins competing explanations for inequality. Where idealists' accounts explain inequality in terms of the causal power of beliefs, ideas, values, and prejudices, materialist accounts look to the distribution and control over resources and power. In contrast, a cultural materialist approach associated with Raymond Williams insists that ideas are materially embedded in practices and institutions rather than either preceding them or floating free of them. This seems far more helpful in determining how it is, for example, that racism takes hold than approaches which ignore either the role of material inequalities or what Williams called the controlling power of ideas. The explanations, of course, are also tied to questions of remedy, which is the final part of the framework. For it is the case that certain kinds of explanation give rise to certain kinds of remedies, as we shall now see. In crude terms, two key sets of issues arise in thinking through strategies for achieving greater equality. The first concerns the dominant framing of redistribution and recognition, the idea that strategies for change concern either redistributing some resource or allocating equal respect to certain groups. This is problematic insofar as it aligns with the idealist-materialist distinction just described, calling up a culture-economy dichotomy and forcing a choice between idealist remedies that suggest that changing minds is sufficient, and it isn't, and materialist remedies that ignore to their detriment the controlling power of ideas. Furthermore, these categories tend to imply a social reordering rather than restructuring and are insufficiently broad to account for the full breadth of inequalities I've laid out. Secondly, there's the age-old revolution reformer problem, sometimes parsed in parallel terms as a distinction between affirmative and transformative strategies. I don't think I need to rehearse these problems here for this audience. I think we're familiar with what's at stake here. So turning to the framework I've been developing, I propose firstly replacing the dominant redistribution recognition dyad with the relational distributive dyad I've been describing, as this is embedded in a matrix of categorical and spatial inequalities. If a relational inequality refers to a relationship in which one group is subject to the power or disrespect of another, then relational remedies are responses that change relations between people and places so that they are more equal. Since relational inequalities include exploitation, oppression, and marginalization, among others, the appropriate remedy cannot be simply recognition of the equal value of disrespected groups, but must also include the equalization of material, economic, and political relations. Furthermore, these relational remedies cannot then be construed as purely idealist or cultural. While some of them involve as a priority changing people's minds, all of them also involve material reconfigurations of relations, processes, and institutions too. The same sort of argument applies vis-a-vis distributive remedies. If a distributive inequality refers, as I've described it, to a situation where one group or person has less of some valued resource than another, then distributive remedies are responses that distribute resources between people and places so that the distribution is more equal. Since distributive inequalities include inequalities of assets, capital, and resources very broadly understood, the appropriate remedy cannot simply be redistribution through taxes and transfers, but must also include pre-distribution, including things like setting minimum and maximum wages, corporate and financial regulations, strengthening wage bargaining, and the shaping of markets through regulatory and legal reforms, but also things like participatory budgeting and social restructuring that includes collective ownership and community wealth building. Distributive remedies too cannot be defined as wholly or only economic, but are clearly political and social and cultural in character too. Finally, and this is the final slide, so I hope I have time for this. Do I, Mike? Okay. In trying to overcome the unproductive reform or revolution dilemma, or strategies that affirm or transform the social structure, some on the left have started to talk about non-reformist reforms, a phrase that seems originally attributable to Andre Gorse. It's an awkward phrase, but the principle is that we should seek reforms that weaken the power of capital and enhance the power of the working class, with the aim of creating the ideological and structural conditions for further wins, rather than, as Rosa Luxemburg had it, reforms that would strengthen, stabilize, and legitimize capitalism. I find Eric Olin Wright's version of this principle most helpful, as he articulated it in the Real Utopias project. There he distinguished basically between reforms that are consistent with more radical change and reforms that impede more radical change. The principle is that it is politically and strategically feasible and practical to articulate and move towards short and medium term goals, not just as a stepping stone to larger term goals, but also as a means to this end. It is precisely by achieving some shorter term goals that people see both the positive gains of equality and feel its greater attainment, not utopian, but sensible and possible. This idea can be applied to think about change within other durable systems of inequality too, not just capitalism, but also patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, and their historical coevolution. Looking at this in terms of the framework I've been delineating, we can see that an example of a distributive remedy that impedes radical change might be a means-tested welfare payment, since this gives rise to shallow surface reallocations of resources only, without changing the conditions that give rise to the inequality in the first place. Further, the target group are stigmatized, marked as needy, and the source of the problem. In contrast, a distributive remedy that promotes radical change is a universalist welfare payment, which, although it does not immediately change the conditions giving rise to the inequality, and so is not revolutionary in that ordinary sense, does not either stigmatize certain groups as needy, but instead opens up a vision of a collectively resourced society based on a solidaristic notion of a public good, thereby making the radical socialist vision that little bit more commonsensical and possible. An example of a relational remedy in relation to gender equality that impedes radical change might be, for example, the infamous lean-in strategy, which attempts to enable women to compete with men at the upper echelons of the corporate world. As Bell Hooks argued a long time ago, as long as any group defines liberation as gaining social equality with ruling class white men, they have a vested interest in the continued exploitation and oppression of others, and of course, no motivation to change the structures which make such inequality possible in the first place. In contrast, an example of a relational remedy that promotes radical change is the introduction of compulsory paternity leave. As studies from Scandinavia have shown, while not a revolutionary change in that sense, it has done more than any other measure to change attitudes towards gender roles, thereby making further moves towards gender equality more possible in practical and ideological terms. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I think that last slide about reform and revolution, I suspect, feeds nicely into the next talk by Oisín Gilmore. Oisín is an economist working in Ireland. He's completing a PhD in economics at the University of Groningen. He was active in the anarchist communist movement for 13 years, and he's written for Viewpoint and Jacobin. So Oisín, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Marie. That was a really interesting presentation. November 2020 might seem like a strange time to talk about the rise of democratic socialism. Rather than democratic socialism experiencing a new dawn, perhaps this is the dusk of a certain moment in the socialist movement. Our hopes were briefly turned towards electoral campaigning. In Greece, Syriza implemented austerity. In France, Mélenchon didn't make it into the second round. In the Spanish state, the hope for Podemos, Barcelona and Camus and others have at least moderated. In the UK, Corbyn is gone, and in the US, Bernie didn't get the nomination. Perhaps this left populism was just a fleeting moment that's now been defeated, will pass into history as a footnote, and socialists can return to the real work of building an autonomous labour movement. Given time constraints, I'm unable to discuss fully the paper upon which this presentation is based. In that paper, I make two arguments and then draw a number of conclusions from them. The first argument I make is that the recent turn to electoralism on the radical left is a logical development in the socialist movement that marks a welcome turn away from politics that advocate for an exclusively extra-parliamentary labour and socialist movement. The second argument is that the relationship between reform and revolution, frequently drawn on the radical left, needs to be reconceptualized to involve a temporal dimension. If revolution is not in the proximate future, how, I ask, should it be conceptualized? Finally, I draw a number of conclusions from these arguments, highlighting the need to refocus socialist politics away from questions of organization of revolution and towards questions of transition to a post-capitalist society. However, today, I will only focus on the first argument, that regarding the turn to electoralism. Here, I try to follow an old Marxist idea. In his famous 1834 correspondence with Ruge, Marx wrote, "We shall not say, abandon your struggles, they are mere folly. Let us provide you with true campaign slogans. Instead, we shall simply show the world why it is struggling, and consciousness of this is a thing it must acquire whether it wishes or not." The point Marx is making here is not that communists cannot discuss strategy, but rather that they must not simply dismiss existing struggles as mere folly, and instead provide movements with true campaign slogans. Instead, the task is to understand struggles as they exist. And over the last number of years, hundreds of thousands of people have engaged in electoral politics to advance their material interests as members of the working class. And in this, they have been followed by hundreds of former or current anarchists and libertarian communists. The personal stories and examples are countless. I'm sure that most people on this watching this video know activists who came from a broadly libertarian left and have joined political parties over the last 5 years or so. To understand how this came to be, it is worth examining the politics of libertarian socialists and how the limits of this politics became clear after the 2008 crisis. Socialism, communism, anarchism. There are many terms for the post-capitalist society we dream of, where class rule and wage dependence have ended, where the apparatus of the state has dissolved into society, where production is democratically organized according to the principle of to each according to need, from each according to ability. But this post-capitalist society is not simply a dream or an idea, and the struggle for it is not simply a struggle over ideas. It's a practical one. The question that faces us is, how do we move from our current capitalist society to this future society? Anarchism was and is one answer to that question. But it is an answer that, while very attractive during the long period of defeat that followed the end of the post-war compromise, was demonstrated to be unsatisfactory during the struggles following the crisis of 2008. I should note here that although I use the term anarchism, my argument should apply in general to all libertarian, anti-authoritarian, anti-statist, councilist and ultra-left variants of communism. The basic anarchist idea is that the road to socialism is through the autonomous self-organization of the working class. This focus on the working class as the social agent that brings about socialism is, or at least was, common across the socialist movement. It is not unique to anarchism. What is unique to anarchism is its understanding of self-organization. Anarchists argue that the working class needs to organize itself autonomous from the state and from capital. The anarchist strategy for revolution is to engage in autonomous self-managed social struggles. The two basic tactics pursued by anarchists is to argue that struggle should be A, driven through bottom-up democracy, and B, use direct action. The former idea excludes movements that are driven by politicians, celebrities, or NGOs. Instead, movements should be controlled through the decisions of grassroots activists. This latter idea also excludes representational action, for example, electing a politician to do something for you, but also any kind of strategy where the power of the movement is delegated away so that somebody does the work for you. As the saying goes, anarchism is do-it-yourself politics. Assuming that through self-organized struggle, people will become both radicalized and aware of what can be achieved through self-organization, this focus on tactics, procedure, and organizational form translates into a strategy. This strategy is further supported by the argument that these tactics of grassroots activism and direct action are uniquely effective in securing victories. The idea is that through victorious struggles, people become increasingly radicalized, capable of further struggles and confident in their ability to win in future struggles. On the basis of one struggle, another bigger struggle can be built, and so on. Ultimately, we will see the working class become organized to such a degree that it can confront the state and the capitalist class head-on in a revolutionary struggle. And the experience of self-organized struggle will provide the skills necessary to create a self-organized democratic post-capitalist society. But after 150 years of anarchist politics, there is an obvious problem. Where is the promised self-organization of the working class? If anything, the working class over the last 30 years has become less organized, militant, and less self-confident than it was in the previous 100 years. The response from anarchists to this obvious problem involves an account of the history of the workers' movement. Anarchists point to how in the late 19th and early 20th century, the workers' movement actually developed much as anarchists argue struggles should develop, on the basis of direct action and democratic organization that is autonomous from the state and from capital. Perhaps most prominently, this was seen in revolutionary syndicalism, the IWW in America, the CGT in France, the CNT in Spain, New Unionism in England, the ITGWU in Ireland, etc. At the time, the argument between anarchists and non-anarchist socialists was largely one of orientation. Anarchists argued that these self-organized movements were a sufficient basis for the struggle for socialism, and that the socialist movement should not try to take state power. Non-anarchist socialists argued rather that the socialist movement should struggle for state power. As is well known, after the Russian Revolution, the non-anarchist socialist movement split in essentially every country between those following Lenin, who argued that workers should engage in armed revolution to seize state power, and social democrats who argued that the socialist movement should compete in democratic elections to take state power. With the spread of the franchise and democratic government after World War I, these two tendencies came to dominate the socialist movement, and anarchism largely faded away as a mass movement. The persistent anarchist critique of these movements and of state socialism that emerged in both its Eastern Bloc and its Western Bloc forms was relatively simple, but also entirely accurate. That is, that neither amounted to the democratic self-managed society that was supposed to be the aim of socialism. Many socialists would grant the legitimacy of that criticism, but they would argue that state socialism was a stepping stone towards democratic self-managed socialism. And anarchists would in turn reply that that was impossible, arguing that the only source of democratic self-managed socialism was the kind of democratic self-managed movements described above. This critique re-emerged as a prominent left-wing viewpoint at two points after the post-World War I revolutionary period. The first time this viewpoint re-emerged with force was at the high point of the post-war compromise. By the 1960s, there had been massive improvements in working class living standards and a very substantial socialization of the economy. But the limits of the state-oriented socialization were practically critiqued in the movements of the late 60s and early 70s, as the working class demanded greater freedom and democratic control. However, the political aspirations of the 60s quickly reoriented around the state, and ultimately the self-managed struggles during this period ended with a series of defeats and the emergence of neoliberalism between the late 70s and early 90s. By the 1990s, the larger tendencies on the 20th century left were so weakened that anarchist and libertarian politics once again became a major part of the radical left. This was not because anarchist and libertarian politics had gained a mass following, but rather because of the total implosion of the social democratic and Leninist parties. The anarchist argument in this period was clear, challenging, and quite persuasive. The state socialist left was now largely defeated, but even if it wasn't, it could never deliver a democratic socialist future because of its orientation towards the state. Democratic self-managed struggles had to be the basis for building socialism. Therefore, the challenge for socialists was to learn the lessons of the past and rebuild working class organization, but this time on a democratic self-managed basis, autonomous from the state and capital. The obvious problem with this argument was that while it was intellectually and rhetorically appealing, it still faces the basic problem that the kind of working class organization that anarchists advocated existed essentially nowhere. The anarchist reply was that while this might be true, this is largely because of the defeat of the old working class organizations and of the state socialist movement. But although the old left was defeated, the underlying class conflicts that gave rise to it had not gone away. And inevitably, mass social struggle would happen again. and it could result in the building up from the grassroots organizations of struggle, just like we saw in the early days of the labor movement. Once again, anarchists claimed, we will see organizations like the ITGWU, CGT, IWW, CNT, etc. emerge. This argument had some appeal between 1989 and 2008, when throughout this period, the old unions and socialist parties of the post-war era continued to either wither away or shift dramatically to the right. During this period, anarchists and libertarian ideas and practices played a central role in nearly every major social struggle, whether it was the Zapatistas in Mexico, the environmentalist movement, the anti-globalization struggle, in social centers, in the anti-war movement, or in the various small-scale industrial struggles that occurred around new syndicalist unions. But after the crisis of 2008, this argument began to break down. In the subsequent recession, mass social struggle re-emerged. Struggle took place across the US and Europe in a way that had not occurred for decades. Yet these struggles did not develop as anarchists had expected. No struggle after 2008 saw the re-emergence of the kind of mass self-organization that was characteristic of the pre-World War I labor movement. Instead, widespread single-issue struggles and movements often came out of nowhere and then collapsed just as quickly. There were workers' struggles over redundancies, there were public sector industrial disputes, struggles over austerity measures, struggles related to particular oppressions like Black Lives Matter and the pro-choice movement in Ireland. Largely, these movements remained separate from one another. They did not generalize into struggles over the control of society. Through these struggles, activists made interconnections, learning from one struggle and bringing those lessons to another. And there were moments when people came together to try to connect disparate struggles in the form of mass assemblies. This happened in the movement of the Squares, in Occupy, and more recently in the Yellow Vests movement in France. But while none of these movements should be disparaged or dismissed, rarely did they amount to the re-emergence of class organization equivalent to the workers' organizations of the early 20th century. Further, these movements rarely remained completely autonomous from the state. When these movements were successful on their own terms, such as with the Yellow Vests in France, or with repeal and the water charges movement in Ireland, the interlocutor in these struggles was almost without exception the state. In almost no situation did these struggles confront the power of the capitalist class, except as when that power was mediated through the state. And it is in relation to state power that these movements have had their greatest afterlife. While these movements have failed to coalesce into autonomous self-managed working class organizations, there has frequently, but not universally, been a coalescing of these struggles around electoral campaigns and the mass party. Although highly different, political hopes and organizational efforts were galvanized around Syriza in Greece, Corbyn in the UK, Sanders in the US, Unidas Podemos in Spain, and Mélenchon in France. In some ways, this is not surprising. The Western world is radically different to what it looked like at the height of the classical anarchist movement before the Russian Revolution. At least three major differences are worth highlighting. Firstly, there's the democratization of the state. In Western Europe, prior to 1880, when anarchism was still the largest tendency in the socialist movement, fewer than 15% of people of voting age had to vote. In states where the male franchise was widespread, such as Germany, a weak parliament played a largely consultative role to an unelected government. During the interwar period, prior to the fascist counter-revolution, essentially all Western European states achieved democratic government, and the franchise had increased to over 93% of the population. The second major difference is the increased intervention of the state in the labour market on the side of the working class. In almost no countries were there any pro-worker labour market regulations prior to 1870. But between 1870 and 1914, there was the introduction of factory inspections, regulation of conditions of work in factory, laws against child labour, and the legal regulation of the length of the working day. Once these laws were introduced, they became stronger and stronger. The state also intervened by introducing accident insurance, unemployment insurance, sickness insurance, and old age insurance. These forms of social insurance were not always provided through the state. By the Second World War, all Western European states had ensured that almost every worker was covered by some form of social insurance. The third major difference is the expansion of the state sector in general. Today in Europe, the state provides education, healthcare, municipal services, etc. Prior to 1880, government spending constituted less than 10% of total spending in Western European economies. By the interwar period, that had more than doubled to over 20%. And by 2008, for the EU 15, government spending constituted 46.7% of total spending in the economy, just under half. In brief, the state is far larger, far more important for labour relations, and far more democratic than at the high point of anarchism. The anarchist idea that it was possible, never mind desirable, to rebuild the workers' movement in Western democracies in such a way that it would not turn to electoral struggles over control of the state is in retrospect almost bizarrely naive. Any workers' movement in a Western democratic state will inevitably struggle over the policies of that state. And given this, there is little argument that the movement should not engage in electoralism, whereby it might effectively and perhaps directly determine the policies of the state. In many ways, anarchists succeeded in demonstrating that self-managed struggles form the most effective and empowering form of organizing. They made convincing arguments that our methods of struggle should prefigure a future free self-managed society. Anarchists, myself included, thought that these demonstrations and arguments proved that the state was not a sensible object of struggle. But we had only made an argument regarding how we should struggle, not an argument regarding what we should struggle over. Today, it has become increasingly clear that struggle over the control of the state and determination of state policies is and will remain central to any forward-looking working-class political project. As a result, working-class socialist activists are organising through the party form and engaging in electoral work. It should not be surprising that radicalised workers are flocking to parties when parties have the potential to bring about social change in a way that is not true of any other organisational form. We should be aware of Marx's warning not to dismiss existing struggles as mere folly. Today, party politics is a primary terrain for class struggle, and socialists should not avoid it. Thanks.
Thank you, Oisín. That's great. So our final speaker is Paula Rauhala. She's a PhD student in philosophy at Tampere University, where she also teaches. Paula, over to you. Paula, yeah, okay.
All right, so I am going to talk about proposals for the socialism in the 21st century in the light of some experiences of the 20th century. Alin Cottrell and Paul Cockshott, and independently from them, Heinz Dietrich, have proposed models for socialism for the 21st century. These are proposals for a non-monetary equivalence economy based on working time accounting and direct democracy. When evaluating the strengths and the weaknesses of these proposals, it might be useful to revisit an East German debate regarding the possibility to estimate socially necessary labor times for various products. In 2007, in his commentary to Dietrich's proposal, an economist from the former East Germany, Harry Nick, argued that this particular debate in the early 1960s GDR, into which he himself also participated, demonstrated that a moneyless economy is incompatible with Marx's principle for the first phase of communism, that is the principle of equivalence. And this name comes from Arno Peters, this principle of equivalence. So, socialism without money is not feasible, Nick argued on the basis of this discussion. In order to make sense of all this, I will first explain how I understand what Marx and Engels proposed for the first phase of communist society. What is the principle of equivalence? Then I introduce the models for socialism for the 21st century. And after that, I will summarize what I have called as the labor value measurement debate in the early 1960s GDR. And this will then help to understand the critique Nick and other economists from the former GDR have presented regarding the socialism for the 21st century. Marx, Engels, and Lenin thought that socialism should be a moneyless economy without trade. An economist from the former GDR, Klaus Müller, notes. And Müller asks, how realistic position is this actually? In Capital Volume 3, Marx writes, even after the capitalist mode of production has been abolished, the determination of value will still prevail in the sense that the regulation of labor time and the distribution of social labor among the various branches of production will become more essential than ever, as well as the keeping accounts on this. Engels discusses the topic in Anti-Düring. In communism, society can simply calculate how many hours of labor are contained in a steam engine, a bushel of wheat of the last harvest, and so on. The problem is how to realize this classical account of socialism, how to organize a complex modern society in which people will be able to manage everything very simply without the intervention of the much wanted value as Engels dreams. How to organize a moneyless economy in which every individual producer receives back from the society exactly what he gives to it, as Marx envisions. How to organize an economy in which the money and the market would be abolished and in which the same amount of labor which an individual has given to society in one form, he or she receives back in another. And this would be possible according to Marx if measurement was made with an equal standard, that is labor. Few Marxian economists have been as optimistic regarding the possibility of measuring the labor contents of commodities and services as Paul Cockshott and Alvin Cottrell are. In their book Towards a New Socialism, Cockshott and Cottrell present a model of a moneyless economy in which planning and distribution would be based on labor time accounting. Following Marx, the authors propose that the labor time should play a double role. First, it would replace money as a unit of account within the planning system, and second, each worker would be paid labor credits for each hour worked. And this would render social relations transparent because each worker would be aware of an estimation of her contribution to the value addition and could compare it with the labor content of the bundle of goods and services she consumes. The payment system depends on the idea that the total labor content of each product or service can be calculated. The authors write. Cockshott and Cottrell explain that this model requires an as advanced information and communication technology that it existed only in the mid-1980s in the West, and with respect to the Soviet bloc, this came too late. As Heinz Dietrich puts it, at Lenin's time, the objective preconditions for socialism were not there, and at the time of Gorbachev, the subjective preconditions for socialism were no more present. The possibility of estimating the socially necessary labor contents of various products and services was discussed in the GDR in the early 1960s. As a background of this debate that I have named as labor value measurement debate, it is good to remember that despite the initial hopes for a moneyless planned economy, the Soviet-type centralized planned economies or the state monopolistic socialist economies ended up utilizing some market elements. In 1960, an economist, Johannes Rudolph, in the GDR asked, how is it possible that the planners claim to set the prices of various products consciously below or above the labor values, if at the same time it was maintained that the labor values cannot be estimated? What about the principle of equivalence? Officially, each worker was paid according to her performance. At the same time, according to the official doctrine, the value addition of each worker is not known. How is it then possible that the workers are nonetheless paid according to their performance? Next year, another economist, Ottmar Lendle, proposed that the state socialist countries should start measuring the labor contents of their products. his proposal was not as radical as Cockshott and Cottrell's proposal is. He did not propose that the monetary economy should be abolished and replaced by labor time accounting, but he argued that the estimation of labor contents would increase the informative value of monetary categories that the planners used. So many powerful economists reacting to these proposals argued that the measurement of direct and indirect labor time would not actually yield information about value, that is socially necessary expenditure of labor, but merely about the realized expenditure of labor. Even though most participants of the discussion rejected the possibility to quantify labor values, there were a few research projects for estimating the labor expenditures in different branches of production. A collective led by Günther Wittig designed a matrix of labor expenditures for 25 product groups in the GDR. Wittig and his collaborator Johannes Rudolph explained that the information they produced could help to save labor, to improve the rationality of the price system, and to help consider what should be imported and exported. Rudolph described later in 2007 the results as politically sensitive, especially when it came to the exports. He believes that this was one reason why the materials of the study were confiscated, but the publication of some results was however allowed. The study showed that in the heavy industry and in the agriculture, the labor expenditures were more, and in the light industry and food production less than what had been expected. Earlier in the Soviet Union, the Central Bureau of Statistics had prepared in 1961 a matrix consisting of 83 sectors, and another research was conducted in the Institute for Economic Research of the State Planning Commission of the USSR. And this study showed how some central raw materials like metals or fuels were priced below the estimated labor values, whereas the products of the chemical industry or plastics were priced above the labor values. As said, an economist, Harry Nick, was not very confident about these results, about the results of these studies, and he announced in 1965 that the time is not ripe for the accounting in terms of labor time because it is practically impossible. Nick commented the discussion of the 1960s again in 2007 after Heinz Dietrich had published his book on the 21st Century Socialism, and Nick did not think that things had essentially changed. The main reason for Nick's pessimism was that he did not believe in 1965 and no more in 2007 that the problem of the reduction of complicated labor into simple average labor could be solved. And as long as the reduction problem remains unresolved, it is impossible to maintain the principle of equivalence. Another reason why Nick did not in the 1960s and still in the 2000s believe or have high hopes for such estimations is that he claimed that in the Soviet-type economies, the system of planning was too much based on subjectivist estimations of the planners instead of the objective signals yielded by the market mechanisms. So for Nick, the proposals for a moneyless planned economy based on labor time accounting appeared as attempts to give up the objective signals for good and moving to only uncertain estimations reasoned at the desk of a central planning bureau. And Nick believed that the half-hearted application of the market mechanisms was a big factor behind the failure of these state socialist experiments. So he believed that in the Soviet-type economies, market was inevitable because there was a conflict of interests between the three levels of the economy: individuals, companies, and the state. And Nick thought that the conflict of interests between these stages was an inescapable fact, whatever the ideologist might have explained about the harmony of interests within socialism. So it must be said that, however, Nick believed that genuine socialism, meaning democratic socialism, unlike the 20th century experiments, this kind of genuine socialism is feasible, but he just doesn't believe that socialism without market would be feasible. Here, another participant of the debate, Fritz Behrens, agrees. Behrens comments these issues afterwards in his private notes that he wrote in an inner emigration in the GDR after he had been kicked out from the Academy of Sciences. Is this great, amazing book. So Behrens believes that democratic socialism, that is genuine socialism, is feasible in the future. But he doesn't believe that money and the market could be abolished just like that. They may wither away one day, who knows, but they cannot be done away with. Behrens wrote that it is not essential whether a socialist economy is a monetary or a natural economy. It is only essential whether labor power appears as a commodity. If it does not, then money cannot function as capital. And at this point, I would like to point out that Cockshott, Cottrell, and Dietrich write in a text that all three wrote together, that in Capital, Marx showed how money was at the root of the evils of capitalism. And I do not think that this is a very good formulation. I think that Marx showed how specific relations of production are the root of the evils of capitalism, and money is secondary because money cannot function as capital without the maintenance of class relations. So Behrens thought that the questions of the money and the market are secondary, and that another essential question is the question of interests. And Behrens thought that one of Marx's greatest mistakes was that he alleged that the interests of an individual and of the society could coincide. Behrens thus thought that there will always be a certain conflict of interests between an individual and the society, even in a democratic, genuine socialism. So this is not only a pathology of undemocratic state monopolistic socialism. And for this reason, Behrens thought that the key question in the future is finding a balance between individual freedom and social security. Thus, to conclude, estimation of labor values was not yet reality in the 1960s GDR. And in this sense, I think that Nick does have a point. But even if the quantification of labor values would have been possible in the Eastern Bloc in the 1960s, would it have solved the fundamental problems of the state monopolistic socialist economies? And the answer depends on the answer to the question, what were these fundamental problems? Numerous economists and social scientists of the former GDR have concluded that against the norms set by Marx and Engels, the absence of democracy and individual freedom and the excessive power of the state were the most fundamental problems. The workers did not have much say in the working place, and no more could they act freely within the civil society or in politics. So the abolishment of money and the market would not have solved these problems. Moreover, many Marxist economists of the former GDR think that money and the market were and are in the future indispensable in modern complex economy. Klaus Steinitz, who was a leading researcher of the States Planning Commission of the GDR, explains that the mechanisms of the market can be harnessed to achieve socialist and democratic objectives. Moreover, the state monopolistic experiments showed that the prohibition of the market tends to create a black market. So it is likely that there will be a market whether you want it or not. However, I think that the important point Cockshott, Cottrell, and Dietrich make is that the fact that the products of social labor appear in the value form helps to obscure social relations. And I think that they propose an interesting solution to this problem. Marx explained that the wage form extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid and unpaid labor. And I think that in the GDR, the working population could have had more means to defend their rights if there existed some estimations of the value product of their work and of their own share of it. And I believe that the wage workers in a capitalist society today would equally benefit from such estimations. So as Cockshott and Cottrell explain, prices only tell some things about the past of the commodities that we buy. Prices only tell about the production costs and relative scarcity. Then a labor content printed in the price tag of each commodity would express other important relations behind the ready and finished products, just as, for example, carbon footprint does. So I do not personally believe that the abolishment of the money and the market is strategically a very wise political goal, but I believe that the information regarding the labor content of commodities could possibly, maybe, help to enforce economic democracy in the future. And both these, utopian Western Marxists and more cynical Eastern Marxists agree on their political ideal. It is economic democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Okay, so we've got time now for questions. If you could put questions into the chat, I can feed them to our speakers. We've got a question for Marie. Whilst the five-part equality framework has virtue, can we assume that they are mutually cohering in political struggle and program and compatible in operation, or might they conflict, contradict? But although that's a question put to Marie, the other two speakers, it might be something you want to come in on as well. But Marie first.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a good question. I suppose the aim or the ambition behind trying to put together a framework like this is not necessarily to make it so that the different categories and then the different kind of explanations and remedies they ultimately give rise to, not to sort of shoehorn them in together so that they kind of artificially all cohere with each other, but rather to show that some of the ways we currently conceptualize these things are based on a number of what you might call false dichotomies that are unhelpful within a broader project of conjoining a range of leftist struggles. So I think, for example, the tendency now in some quarters to oppose struggles around gender, sexuality, and race, for example, to struggles around social class, that appears as contradictory. But what I'm suggesting is, if you look at it through the lens of this framework, it looks less contradictory, which isn't to kind of erase different kind of points of difference within the struggles. If you view each of those categories as different categorical distinctions that arise through and out of the kinds of relational and distributive inequalities, then they look less like, that you can only be involved in sort of class struggle or anti-racist struggle or gender-based struggle, because what you're looking at the source are the kinds of relational inequalities that in their evolution and in their practice actually give rise to these kinds of categorical distinctions. And it's the same with the sort of tendency to view remedies in the oppositional terms of recognition and redistribution. I think taking the broader relational distributive framing allows us to see that a lot of what goes under the heading of recognition actually involves a revisioning of material and political social relationships and vice versa. So I suppose I'm not trying to, although I can see how when you kind of do a framework like this, it does look like you're trying to artificially shoehorn very different things into this very neat sort of mathematical mapping. And partly that's to do with sort of the analytical abstraction necessary to get at these kinds of distinctions. But the ultimate aim isn't to kind of falsely push them together, but rather to unpick the kinds of false dichotomies that I think are still very much live in left scholarship and politics. Thanks for the question.
I'm just sort of picking up on that, and I'm going to sort of connect it to Paula's talk, because often spatial inequalities, for example, to address that would require, if we're thinking about the relationship between sort of transfers of value from currently from the global south to the north, or if you wanted to reverse that, people sometimes say, well, what you're basically saying is that people's standards of living in the West would have to decline, and a similar kind of argument is put in relation to addressing climate change as well. That this means a sort of a reduction in standards of living, and that also sort of comes into conflict with a version of Marxism where it's all about increasing the forces of production. So I'm just wondering, how does questions of equality and the spatial sort of transfers or redistributions work? And that's both to you, Marie, and maybe Paula as well.
I'll just come in quickly then. I think what I'm trying to do, I suppose, with the framework is when we look at things like global inequality, I think the kinds of answer generated to the kind of question you've just asked, Mike, depend on whether you view that inequality in relational or distributive terms. And I think if you view it in relational terms, in terms of relations of exploitation or relative powerfulness and powerlessness, then you're looking at changing institutional structures that enable that relational inequality to continue. But I think the way you parsed it was more in terms of a distributive inequality, which gives rise to the kinds of solutions that you suggested there, which is, about reducing living standards in one part of the world, which is in effect a redistributive measure. And it's not that I want to oppose one to the other, but it's to say that if we look at that question, we look at the descriptive inequality between the global north and the global south, the kinds of remedies that suggest themselves to us differ, whether or not we view that inequality as fundamentally relational or distributive, or both. I think it's possible to do both. If that makes sense.
Paula, did you want to come in?
Yeah, well, the reason why I wrote this paper partly was because I thought that, so this is a draft paper that I haven't published, but I wanted to discuss with some people that should I polish it and try to publish it. The reason was that I found these discussions extremely interesting. These are German discussions from the year 2007, in which these former GDR economists comment these proposals. And these old GDR economists, they also emphasize very much that it's the crucial questions are not actually the questions of distribution, or that these are kind of not the only questions and not the most important questions, but we should rather address the questions of like global solidarity or climate change and such questions. Then the whole problem that whether one is getting full compensation from one's work, it's kind of secondary for them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that sort of whole notion that standards of living, it's a very reductive and narrow, because of course, there are so many aspects of life under capitalism that are destructive. For example, the toxicity of the environment that sort of makes cancer a runaway epidemic. So there's lots of ways in which you could sort of pose that question as it is self-ideological. Oisín, I've got a question for you. I mean, you talked about and it seems sort of it is partly autobiographical, the shift from a kind of anarchist politics of kind of non-representation to a sort of party political politics, that sort of working within the existing state, sometimes existing parties, or at least new parties that are trying to get to power into the state. But what about the sort of, you sort of missed out the kind of, I suppose it might be the Leninist kind of tradition to some extent, which is representational, but it has a critique of what you can do within those structures of the capitalist state. I mean, as soon as you start thinking about, say, for example, trying to change the content of the law and to give collective property significantly more weight in the law. They say 9/10 of the law is built around private property. You can immediately see how difficult that might be to put that into practice, and how quickly that might produce a whole range of violent strategies in response. So I'm just wondering, if you've got any thoughts about that kind of critique.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think when we talk about, I guess, the Leninist or Lenin's critique of parliamentary politics and the kind of approach to bourgeois parliaments, I think there's perhaps a need to ask the question, which Lenin? Because at various points in Lenin's life, he kind of seems to present different approaches to this. So one of the, I mean, I mentioned in the paper that I think a lot of what I'm saying is also applicable to kind of council communist perspectives. And if you read, say, Lenin's left-wing communism, there's of course a critique of emerging council communist ideas, and his critique of anti-parliamentarian approaches. His defense of parliamentarian approaches is to say that we can use parliament as essentially he accepts the critique of the limits of what can be achieved through parliamentary action, but he insists that there's a need to engage in parliamentary activity in order to act as tribunes for the working class and to use parliament as a stage upon which you can advance communist arguments. Later, with ideas of workers' government, this seems to change, where the idea kind of emerges that actually through parliamentary activity we can create a workers' government. Later, with other Leninist parties, in the Popular Front period, you get another idea yet again of a different Leninist approach to parliamentary activity. And again, if we go to the later 20th century with, say, the PCI in Italy, you have a kind of another idea yet again of the Leninist approach to parliamentary action. I mentioned in the paper, in what I presented, that in what I've written, I talk kind of, there's three parts to what I wrote. This is one part. Another part is to address the question of reform versus revolution. And I think when we talk about Leninism, very often what's kind of held out is this idea of it's a revolutionary politics, not a reformist politics. Again, if you look at the history, exactly what this distinction means at different points seems to change. Now, I don't particularly want to get into kind of working that out now in the kind of in a question and answer session, but really what I'm trying to just emphasize is that, rather than, I think definitely rather than taking kind of a prescriptive approach on the basis of the lessons of 1917 and applying them to 1917 Russia and applying them to 2020s Western Europe, that we should try to be attentive to the way in which struggles over material concerns are being played out today, and thinking about how these struggles that exist today, in what way can these point towards a potential future transition from capitalism to a socialist economy. Now, on the question of reform versus revolution, I totally accept that. I don't think that there's a reformist road to socialism, but all I'm trying to claim is that there is an important role for struggling for reforms through the use of electoralism and parliamentary struggles that I think is certainly kind of dismissed by anarchist and a lot of anti-state communist tendencies, but I think also within Leninist tendencies, in particular Trotskyist tendencies, is not taken seriously, or not kind of thought about with any kind of depth or serious concern.
I mean, this is a question to all three of you, really. I mean, do you think that the problem, the title of Socialism in the 21st Century, I mean, do you think there's a real crisis of actually imagining that today? I mean, even just, for example, I mean, you mentioned, Oisín, Syriza earlier on. I mean, in other circumstances, in a previous time, the kind of mobilizations that were underpinning the emergence of Syriza and the transformations of its electoral forces might have seemed, you know, on the cusp of a revolution. And I think people thought that there was a potentially revolutionary moment in some ways, but in other ways, there seems to be a real crisis of actually really imagining a shift towards socialism. I mean, it was impossible for the leadership of Syriza to imagine even coming out of the currency of the euro. An example really of the kind of international power of capital to sort of stomp on anything as it emerges in any one sort of national context. So, I mean, does anyone really believe that it's possible anymore? And if that isn't the case, you know, how do we kind of rekindle that spark, that imagination that it is possible? Big question for the three of you. See if you can solve that for us.
Can I come in? Yeah. Well, that's what my paper was supposed to be about, but obviously quite badly. I think that, yeah, I think you're quite right that it is very difficult to imagine a rupture from what we have now and to envisage in any very kind of positive way this new socialist world. But I think there are very strong seeds that we can work with on the left, and I think they have a lot to do with how we understand equality and inequality. And there's a very strong kind of everyday moral resistance to forms of inequality. All the kind of new social movements, although that's not really the accurate way to describe them, but everything from Black Lives Matter to stuff around trans rights. There's a whole kind of vista of very imaginative, creative movements out there that have equality at their heart. And I think that's a good place to begin, because what I've been trying to argue is that equality is absolutely central to the socialist project, but hasn't been quite as well articulated as it might be. And unfortunately, because of the strengths of some forms of liberal egalitarian theorizing, often equality seems to be parsed in opposition to socialism. So, and to kind of come back to something Oisín said a few minutes ago, he said there's no reformist road to socialism. Like, I think that depends very much on how you understand and define reform, and also its apparent opposite, revolution. And that's why I'm convinced by likes of Eric Olin Wright, and he talked a lot about these interstitial strategies that, you know, emerge in the cracks of a capitalist society. And it's not that they should become a sort of widespread, self-organized, autonomous working class movement, but that they, in many important ways, prepare the terrain for a future break. And that break becomes less frightening, less terrifying, more kind of, yeah, less unexceptional. And I think what is central to that is the value of equality. And I think that's key to kind of both imagining this new future, but also creating that interstitial space between what we think of as reform and revolution.
Marie, can I just come back and ask you, how do you convince people that the question of inequality is not a zero-sum game, that, you know, more equality for some group might mean less access to you to resources of the various kinds that you've categorized?
Yeah, well, like everything, you know, there is a job to be done in sort of challenging the kind of more right-wing ideological narratives that are very strong out there, including the claim that equality is a zero-sum game and that people lose from being part of a more equal society. Like, I think we can look to people's own kind of moral intuitions, which I think are quite strong on a personal day-to-day level about equality, but also we can look to things like the work of Wilkinson and Pickett in the spirit level, it showed that equality was better for everyone, not just people at the bottom, that everybody in a more equal society did better on a whole range of things. I think there's different ways of making the argument, but one of the key ways of making it is by showing it. I think in the abstract, making the arguments for equality don't do as much as making small gains for equality and then showing how that is something that people benefit from, can support, can promote in their own lives. There's a sort of a very practical, but it doesn't have to be a massive, large scale project initially, at least. I think it can be built into lots of different things the left do and could do.
Okay, so, so the original question back to the other speakers, one sort of possibility that Marisa points to is building on the seeds that are already there in people's everyday lives. There's what you called the moral intuitions in people's everyday lives. What about the other two speakers? What's the job that has to be done to kind of make socialism seem a realizable prospect, given where we currently are?
Yeah, I would say so. I think one thing that's important is, and as I said, one thing that I don't do in what I presented today, but in the other thing in what I've written is trying to draw this, look at this distinction between reform and revolution again. And I think that certain tendencies within the socialist movement have kind of dealt with this, I think, in a bad way, where a sharp distinction is drawn between the possibility of reform and the question of revolution. And even if we go back to this is this idea that at the moment what we are faced with is a question of reforms which can't actually be achieved because capitalism is in crisis, or revolution, which is the only real possibility. And this is, I think, something that really only becomes prevalent on the Marxist left after the Russian Revolution. Before that, I don't think that was really that prevalent. And even if we look at something like Rosa Luxemburg's Reform versus Revolution, that's not our argument at all. Our argument is very much, so I'll read a brief quote from her on this, because I think her argument is very much that struggling for reform creates the basis for a revolutionary movement. So she says, the daily struggle for reforms, for the amelioration of the condition of the workers within the framework of the existing social order, and for democratic institutions, offers to social democracy the only means of engaging in the proletarian class war and working in the direction of the final goal, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labour. Between social reforms and revolution, there exists for social democracy an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aim. So here, with Rosa Luxemburg, this is kind of the text that everybody pulls out, but she's very clear that the road to revolution is based on fighting for reforms. And I think that's something that gets lost in a lot of kind of left, revolutionary Marxist discussions of the political possibilities, in particular coming from the Trotskyist and certain Leninist traditions, where there is an insistence that the task today is revolution, and that therefore the question is simply the question of the organization, building up the organizational power and the organizational strength that is necessary to bring about a revolution. And this neglects the question of what is it that needs to be done in society to bring about a transformation in the direction of socialism. So that's something that I try to draw out, and what another thing that I write, which is to try to insist that we need to move away from the question of simply the organization of revolution towards questions of the transition from a capitalist to a post-capitalist society. I think that Paula's paper here is like a really interesting example of some of the issues and questions that need to be thought about around that question. So if I can I actually ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah. So a question that I had for Paula was just that in her presentation, one thing that I kind of thought was remarkably absent was Marx's distinction between abstract and concrete forms of labor, which in any kind of discussion about the measurement of labor time, I think would normally be, I guess, central, and certainly in kind of contrasting, if we look at somebody like Cockshott and contrast it with, kind of the Marx lecture or kind of value form theory, there's a kind of big disagreements around the measurement of labor time and what it means and kind of how this can be conceptualized in a post-capitalist society. And a lot of this centers on this distinction between, the kind of value form theorists would very much insist on the importance of this distinction between the abstract form and the concrete form of labor. And I was wondering, is there a reason why you didn't address this, or do you think it's not important, or do you think that it should be addressed in a different way? Or
may I answer, Chair?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's really nice that you ask it, and really interesting. Actually, I've written a paper about this same discussion, this labor value measurement debate, but more on the theoretical side of the problem. And this paper, it has been accepted to Historical Materialism journal, so I hope that you can read it in, I don't know, a couple of years. And in this paper, I contrast the kind of mainstream position in this discussion in the GDR with the Neue Marx-Lektüre. And I try to show that actually the mainstream position in the GDR was that abstract labor is a social relation. It cannot be measured, that value producing labor cannot be measured with the clock, that you can only measure concrete labor time, and that you cannot measure abstract labor time. And so basically they were saying pretty much the same thing as Michael Heinrich, for instance, is saying. And I wrote about that a paper because I think that commonly it is believed, or the Neue Marx-Lektüre kind of promotes a position that their reading of Marx's Capital and Marxist theory of value is quite the opposite to the traditional Eastern Bloc reading. This is not actually true. I think that this position, which regards labor theory of value as an kind of empirically theory that can be and must be empirically tested, I think this position was maybe rather minority in the GDR. And I side with this position. I think that it must be somehow an empirically testable theory. Maybe the difference lies indeed in how we understand abstract and concrete labor. I think that the Neue Marx-Lektüre thinks that concrete labor is something that we can observe. It's something kind of, how to say, not economically interesting. And then abstract labor is labor that produces value and has something to do with money and the market and so on. But I think that, well, my point of departure is different. I think that concrete labor is for Marx an economic category. It is a category of Marx's critique of political economy, and concrete labor in Marx's theory of value. It transfers the value from the means of production to the product. And then abstract labor relates to the value addition. And when you estimate the kind of labor contents of various products, then you have to consider both the value transfer, that's product of concrete labor, meaning labor performed in certain branch, like weaving or spinning. And then when you consider labor abstractly, then it adds value. So it's just the value addition by the living labor. But yeah, this is a huge topic, and I think that we cannot discuss this as long as it would need. But I hope that we can discuss again at some other occasion, maybe in London, HM.
Okay, thank you. Yes. All right. That's a nice point to end thinking about a future offline world next year at the conference. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our three speakers for that fascinating papers and the debates that followed, the discussion that followed. I'd like to remind viewers that the final session of the conference is at 4 o'clock, Marxism and Identity Politics. In registering for that, you'll notice that you have an opportunity to donate to the conference, and the conference is not cost-free, so any donations would be gratefully received. And also to remind you that there is a 25% discount offer currently on the Historical Materialism Journal. But for now, that's it from us. Thanks.